Good morning. My name is Nyhuis. Welcome to the course that explores our potential for lifelong growth in our middle and later decades of life. Our teacher, Terry Nyhuis, is a HAS member. He earned a BA from Hope College, attended Western Theological Seminary, earned an MDiv from Fuller Theological Seminary, and was ordained in the RCA. He served as a senior staff leader and teacher in churches in Southwest Michigan and Southern California. After retirement in his mid-50s, he earned a doctorate from George Fox University. Terry and his wife, Anita, in the red there, moved back to Holland area last year and joined HAS shortly after. And more importantly, he is my brother. Terry is eager to hear your comments and questions, but asks that you hold them to the end of his presentation. For those joining us virtually, please use the chat section to ask questions or make comments. Someone will present them for you during the question and comment time. With that, I'll turn things over to Terry.
Thank you. Good morning. I've taught in churches, so this is a little disconcerting. Nobody's sitting in the back row in these two sections. And I appreciate you spreading out a little bit. I asked Anita and Jean to sit there to make sure that I keep looking at the camera from time to time. But thank you for being here, for your interest in lifelong growth, especially in this season of our lives. And I thank you too for taking a chance on me, a first-time teacher. Will I be boring? Will I be ignorant and so on? But you dare to come here and give me a chance. So I don't take that trust lightly. So thank you. We're looking at lifelong growth, especially in this season of our life. And question has intrigued me for more than 4 decades. And that is, as I have watched people grow and develop and expand in the way they approach their values, perspectives, and beliefs, I see that expansion happening. Then I see so many people around midlife seem to plateau. Their values don't keep expanding. The way they think, the way they expand in their life seems to plateau for so many. I saw it in church life. I've seen it since retirement, talking to people. So I wonder, is that kind of growth just meant for a few people, a minority of mystics or sages or wisdom teachers? Or is there some inherent reason for it? And I've come to the conclusion that there is no inherent reason for anyone to stop growing, being transformed, and to enter into new seasons of human development. So there must be other factors that are going on. So this is a time to imagine, what does it look like for us to keep expanding, to keep learning, to make the latter decades of life, I say, as exciting as earlier decades of life. Now, certainly there are things that happen to us physically. Our brain functions might slow down a little bit from time to time, or as I say, the little file guy that runs around trying to remember names and so on, tends to be a little tired, sometimes a little arthritic. It takes me a while for that kind of thing, but there are ways to expand that are phenomenal. This slide shows how we'll invest our 3 sessions. First one, an overview of lifelong growth that includes all the seasons of our life, all the decades of life. Next week, we'll look at 7 expansions that typically describe human development when we reach those middle and later decades of life. I've read thousands of pages. I earned a doctorate, did a dissertation on it, and I looked at so many people that continued their life, and there are so many different ways of growing, so many different ways of expanding, but 7 themes keep coming up over and over again. So I am eager next week to hear for your lives. And I would suspect that many of you are lifelong learners. Lifelong growth is part of your life, or you wouldn't be here. Same for those that are joining us virtually. And then session 3 is, how do we go about welcoming and actually entering into this kind of growth that lasts a lifetime? I'm proposing 7 proposals, and I don't take that word lightly. I am proposing things. This is not one of those where I say, this is proven fact. This is the way it is. This is a perspective that runs throughout centuries, across cultures and so on, but it is a perspective. Propose is to set before the mind for imitation or action to set before someone, and especially with the idea of considering it. And I especially like that last one. I don't know if you can help me a little bit, but I have some pictures that are covering my notes. We have a guru here to handle this kind of thing. Oh, yes. The guru has spoken. Good, good. And especially that 2A from Merriam-Webster, to set forth for acceptance or rejection. So I take it at this stage of your life that you will consider these. And that doesn't mean I take these lightly. They come from a lot of research, a lot of interactions, a lot of just talking with folks and seeing where they are in their life. So I don't take these proposals lightly. These are the proposals that I am living into, and I propose that you consider them as well. Here are the 7 proposals that we'll cover this morning. This is an overview. First of all, lifelong growth can last a lifetime. That is not taken for granted in Western culture. Second, lifelong growth is offered to us in 5 seasons. Then along the bottom of the slide, I propose these 5, that it's childhood, adolescence, first half adulthood, or a first way of living, the way our culture would generally say this is adulthood, but it's a first adulthood. Then there's something called half-adolescence. And by the way, I made that up. So if you Google it, you're not going to find much. Other developmentalists talk about it in terms of centaur or other things, but half-adolescence, and then a second half adulthood as well. Then 3, our focus mainly for next week, we'll just introduce it this time. Half-adolescence and second half adulthood will expand you 7 ways, which means as you expand, you will find perhaps that you don't fit with family as easily as you once did. Maybe you sit in church and you don't fit there a little bit. It changes us. It causes some tension sometimes, but also some overview. Then 4, our culture understands, appreciates, and supports the first seasons of life, 3 seasons of lifelong growth. And that's kind of a duh. Of course, they encourage, and we have schools we have departments and churches and so on for childhood, adolescence, and for earlier adulthood, but they do not support, generally in our culture, seasons 4 and 5. They don't understand it. They don't appreciate it. It's hard for them to support it. Then 5-season growth needs season 4 and 5 mentors, raising people up. Poets are known somewhat in our culture, which is many of the poets are seasons 4 and 5. But as far as mystics, I know when I went to George Fox after being in seminary, Reformed seminaries for many, many years, they'd start mentioning these people that I hadn't heard of. Saint Teresa. Some of them I'd heard of, and the other ones around me knew these people very well. So I just recognize in my culture, I didn't have strong models of latter seasons of development. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Most people plateau in their lifelong growth in midlife. More of us, however, in this generation are entering into seasons 4 and 5. We'll talk about why that is. Lifelong growth must be welcomed, received, and lived into. So that'll form the trajectory of our overview today. Proposal 1, lifelong growth can last a lifetime, including throughout our midlife and beyond. And again, there's no inherent reason. When I say inherent, that means for me, there's nothing built into us as human beings that say we should plateau our growth, that the latter decades of life in our 60s, 70s, and 80s should be less exciting in terms of growth and discovery and exploration than, say, even in our teens or 20s or 30s. There's nothing inherent. There might be some cultural reasons for that, however. I propose that there are 2 general perspectives on human growth. The approach to lifelong growth that's held by most, I show in this graphic, where people expect to grow, lifelong growth, transformation, seasons of growth, stages of development. very strong in those first 3 seasons. That up until midlife, one would certainly expect if a 6th grader is acting and living into life more like a 4 or 5-year-old, we'd say there's some arrested development. Something's going on. If adults aren't maturing, as far as in their young adulthood, we'd say, what's going on? By the way, that is happening in culture. So I recognize that there are those who don't seem to mature much beyond their 20s, but generally we'd expect young adults. But then it's interesting, somewhere around midlife in our culture, I believe people expect to become mature. And thereafter, we live as mature adults. If that was true, then we could call ourselves make sure I get it right, Hope Academy of Mature Professionals. I'm glad you laugh because you can call me old, you can call me aged, you can call me lots of things. Just please don't call me a mature adult because that means I'm done. And I don't want to be done. I hope to never be mature, just to keep growing all the way through my life. So that's a very important thing. So again, call me aged, senior, retired, whatever. Just don't call me mature. Another approach views the trajectory of lifelong growth this way, that there's no reason for it to stop, that there is more expansion to take place. There's more to learn, that I would hope that in my life, all the way through, as long as I'm given life, as long as my financial planner says, as long as the cheese doesn't slide off the cracker somewhere upstairs, that I will keep growing, that I will keep learning, that my values will keep expanding, that I'll wonder that when I vote in the next week or two through absentee ballot, that somehow the way I'm thinking, my values have expanded, or I've learned, or how I vote now might be different from how I voted two or 4 years ago, because I keep learning, I keep expanding, I keep wondering. Or as one theologian said, if the you that you are today, you wouldn't 20 years ago have called yourself a heretic, maybe you're not growing. If you could say, I don't know, who is this Terry? What is he talking about? Is he nuts? Maybe I'm growing, maybe I'm learning. So this is the graphic that I keep in my own head in terms of where I hope to go. So I studied all kinds of journals. I read memoirs and biographies. I collaborated with people. As I said, I dug into a dissertation and I looked at who are these folks? Who do we find there in the second half of life? And it was amazing when I looked across cultures, different faiths. Certainly I looked at my own Christian heritage, but I looked at Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim. I looked across the way, and including those that claim no faith at all. It was amazing how similar the folks were that I found over on that end. And when I found them, I recognized that we've called them lots of names. We're not quite sure what to call these folks that are later second half adult, or if you're in that stage yourself, what descriptors would you be given? Sometimes they're called mystics, poets, saints, and sages. Sometimes they're called elders or wise ones or wisdom teachers. Other faith traditions call them enlightened ones. So all these different names, and they're also named in demeaning ways. I found that some of these folks that think in this expanded way are called heretics. They're called disloyal. They're called strange. They've lost their way, or we need to bring them back to sanity. So there are different ways of identifying them. And the other way, I'd say, if you identify as a second half adulthood, who would I expect to find there? I'd expect you to have many of the similar characteristics to these folks. And as I age in that direction or grow in that direction, I hope those descriptors fit me better and better. And we'll look again at the 7 that really talk about that. One developmentalist and author, Ken Wilber. Anybody here have read Ken Wilber? A little bit. He's chewy. You got to really work with him, some of his books, but amazing. This quote, The world's great mystics and sages represent some of the very highest, if not the highest of all stages of human development. Most of the mystic sages have left rather detailed records of the stages and steps of their own transformations into the superconscious. He calls superconscious that later development. That is, they tell not only of the highest level of consciousness and superconsciousness, but also of all the intermediate levels leading up to it. So he talks about these folks as well, and he's done research vastly over all these different cultures and so on, and he writes in some of that, and I use him as a source from time to time. If this is so, and I am personally convinced it is, that these folks are examples of that, then I believe they represent not so much odd people, not so much huge exceptions to the usual norm, which is, by the way, a way for us to marginalize them and say, oh, these people are special. No, I'd rather not think of them as special. I'd rather than think of them as examples, saying they represent and help me to move in the same direction that they were in. So we'll continue to work with that overview. Then on to proposal 2, lifelong growth is offered to us in 5 seasons. And for this one, it's partially arbitrary. There are different folks that talk about 2 seasons of life, the first half and the second half. Richard Rohr would be one. Carl Jung is another one. There are those that talk about first half of life, so they divide it into really 2 things they talk about. Others, Ken Wilber talks about 12 stages, which I've studied and I can't remember what they are. They all go through each other after a while. It's too complex for my brain. James Fowler talks about 7, Erik Erikson 8. I started in developmentalism with Erik Erikson, who talks about 8 stages. Robert Keegan also talks about 5. So these 5 stages are not over and against them. It's not arguing with them. For 5, I expand on the 2. First half of second half of life, and add a third, really first half adulthood, second half adulthood with half adolescence in between. And I combine some others just to keep my head around it. Western culture really does understand. So childhood, adolescence, and earlier adulthood are very commonly understood. We expect physical changes. We expect changes in terms of their mental, children's and adults, our adolescents' ability to think. That's one of the major things of adolescence. Their brain is able to operate in more complex ways. Certainly adolescence hormones jump in and all kinds of things happen. And we understand, we support that. In churches I was in, we always had a complex children's program. We had a complex adolescent type program where we'd have, quite often put them in a separate building because we weren't quite sure how to merge the 2. But we had staff for them and special trained folks that focused on that. And then for young adulthood, we had parenting classes, we had leadership classes, all those things. So we understand and support the earlier stages very, very well. We expect all kinds of expansions to happen there. But then we run into 2 more, half adolescence and second half adulthood. This 4th one, half adolescence, generally happens to us around midlife, though I've met some in their 30s who were already into half adolescence. There was this disruption, a second, I call it adolescence because it is a second adolescence. Adolescence is that intense time with hormones jumping in and social expectations and more complex thinking. It's disruptive, it's exciting, it's chaotic, it's horrible, it's wonderful, all those things. I like to think about half adolescents too. I love to meet a good half adolescent who has all kinds of questions, who's a little ornery sometimes, who's exploring things, who's changing the way they look, the way they talk, and so on, because something is going on inside themselves. Sometimes we call it midlife crisis. Midlife crisis, let's send them to a psychologist or to a group and figure it out so they can get back. It's like, no, half adolescents, you send them to a mystic, you send them to a wisdom teacher, you send them to old people that are really continuing to grow and help them to move forward. not to bring them back, not to restore them back. So a second adolescence. And adolescence is easier to see adolescence because there are body changes. You know, there's certainly brain complexity happens. There are hormones, all those things. Half-adolescence is a little tougher. We'll talk about that next session. What does it look like when a person shifts into half-adolescence? And then second half adulthood. Others call this season different things. Erik Erikson calls it generativity and integrity. Wilber calls it super consciousness, and he includes several stages in that. Kohlberg calls it post-conventional principled. Maslow calls it self-actualization. So there are different ways. I love this particular quote by James Hollis. He describes the fifth season of our lives this way. In, I would say, second half adulthood, we learn that life is much riskier, more powerful, more mysterious than we had ever thought possible. While we are rendered more uncomfortable by this discovery, it is a humbling that deepens spiritual possibility. The world is more magical, less predictable, more autonomous, less controllable, more varied, less simple, more infinite, less knowable, more wonderfully troubling. I love that term. Wonderfully troubling than we could ever have imagined being able to tolerate when we are younger. One way to indicate whether you may be in half-adolescence or bumping toward the end of first half adulthood is if you look at that and go, yeah, that's the way I'd like my faith life to be. That's the way I'd like to face complex issues in the world, that things are troubling, they're complex, they're more mysterious, more magical, more wonderfully troubling than ever possible that we could have imagined. We'll talk about that again more. So when we choose a 5-season approach to life, we never stop growing. Each season is rich in potential for growth, purpose, and meaning. And the later decades of life can be as filled with adventure, challenge, exploration, discovery, and expansion as were our earlier decades of life. I had a picture of that. For a while, I was the lead pastor at Trinity Reformed Church here in Holland until they and I discovered that I make a terrible senior pastor, that I'm much better staff. But anyway, I was there for a while. And one day I visited an older lady, Mary Gee. Any of you ever hear of Mary Gee? Mary Gee was a retired missionary, and she was in a nursing home, and I went over there to visit her. And I walked into her room. I didn't know much about her at all, except that she was a parishioner, so I called on her. And as I walked in the room, I saw a lady facing away from me who was in the fetal position. She couldn't straighten out, she couldn't take care of herself or whatever. And I walked into the room tentatively, and she says, "Stop sneaking around. You the preacher?" Yes. "Move around in front of me, get that chair and sit down so I can take a look at you." It's like, okay. And it was amazing when I sat down and looked into her eyes. I've never seen brighter eyes. I've never seen a deeper smile. And to just listen to her, I just shut up because I knew immediately there was nothing that I could much say. But she was one of these mystics. And she was so full of life. And she said, "This is the best time of my life. I get to talk to people. I get to pray. People bathe me. They take care of me. They feed me. They do everything." And it was amazing when I left her room later on, just totally uplifted and shocked. The staff said, "We love, after our shift is done, we go in there and sit with her for a while." So I'm thinking, you know what? She was still growing. She was still learning. She was still expanding. You look at her life and say, her world has gotten so small. But I sat there looking at Mary and saying, my life was much smaller than hers was. So that's the kind of growth and transformation I'm talking about. Then the third proposal, expect half-adolescence and second half adulthood to expand you 7 ways. And another way to say it is that when you enter half-adolescence and second half adulthood, your values, perspectives, and beliefs are going to be messed with 7 different ways. Things are going to shift. I was wondering how this, but I haven't talked this much in a long time. 7 ways. So this is really starting to preview next week. Again, over the past 15 years, I looked at all kinds of descriptions. I looked at journals, I looked at surveys, I talked to people that were in their second half adulthood, and I recognized that 7 themes come up over and over and over again. 7 common ways. Again, we experience middle and later adulthood in thousands of different ways. When we lived in Southern California, the way many of those folks were experiencing later years is very different from the way we will experience them here in Holland after moving back here. And different cultures, different nations, and so on, lots of different ways. But there are 7 themes, no matter where they are, be it 5, 10 centuries ago, be it in a mainly Muslim culture, or mainly Christian culture, whatever it is, there are 7 things that keep appearing. These are the 7. I don't know if you'll be able to see the graphic, but in earlier adulthood, in that first half adulthood, there are 7 themes that keep coming up over and over again. And all you need to do really is think about politics right now and say, are politicians first half adults? Look through the list. Or the same thing with many of the preachers in our churches. And I understand because I taught and preached as a first half adult, first half preacher, if you will, through most of my career. Deal with either or certainty, being quite confident. I had all kinds of books in my library and systematic theology, where we had defined God pretty carefully. We knew who God was. We knew the way he acted. I can't say he anymore, the way God acted. So I understood all those. Now, as I read the mystics, I recognize God is much more mysterious, more wonderful, more amazingly troubling than I ever imagined. But either or certainty, conventional boundaries, accepting a certain way of life, settling into it, sticking with it, warrior perspectives, being able to stand against strength with strength, aspiration for more. First half adults, if you want to, 1-word summary, and many of them, it's more. More is better. More influence, doing more good, getting more done, accumulating more. External orientation. I remember I was at a time of stress in my life, and I went to a psychologist and I said, I have so much to get done, but I'm burning out. So I give you 7 sessions to fix it. And Bill just laughed at me, and I think 4 or 5 months or even years later, we were still struggling with it because I was external. I had to get things done. I needed to do things, which isn't all bad because raising family, building career, establishing a household, all those things take a lot of effort. But it's not a misnomer or not a surprise that sometimes we call it navel gazing. Don't spend too much time navel gazing. Just get on with life, move on. So external orientation earlier on, group loyalty. Oh my, again, we can look at politics. Try to break free from group loyalty, or in a church, certain expectations, break free from that, tough. And then ego building. I retired from Crystal Cathedral Ministries. I saw what was happening and I thought I'm too old to deal with this kind of thing, but self-esteem. How many churches build on self-esteem, that ego building is very important. Then in half a lessons and ego building, we expand beyond each of these. Each of these served us well, perhaps. They're important in our culture. That's where people need to be. But then we expand beyond each one of those. So we'll talk about that much more next week. So 3 core principles of lifelong growth. If you're in real estate business are aware of that. What are the 3 rules of real estate? Location, exactly. And the core principles of lifelong growth, transformation, and development are 3: expansion, expansion, and expansion. You stop expanding, you stop growing. So we'll talk about those expansions of our values, perspectives, and beliefs. First, frequently asked questions. When I talk about this, one of the first ones is, do the 5 seasons usually come in this order? Can one skip a season? A quote from Ken Wilber helps me understand that. Ken Wilber gives in this analogy, lifelong growth is very like the geological formation of the earth. Psychological development proceeds stratum by stratum, level by level, stage by stage, with each successive level superimposed upon its predecessor in such a way that includes but transcends it. Developmentalists might talk about it differently in different ways, that the different languages, but each season. Now, obvious that adolescence builds on childhood. Or you could say just looking in childhood stages, you know, when an infant is just always moving, you know, building muscles and so on, prepares them for crawling. Then it prepares them for that, or in classes. You learn, you know, I learned all kinds of math and science and so on in elementary. And then at Hope, when I was a physics major, had to expand beyond that. I didn't throw it out, but things weren't quite as clear as they were before and built on it. So each one builds on the other. Now, the thickness of the layers might change. Like as I said, some people might go into half-adolescence in their 30s. So it took them 15, 20 years to build that thickness on which they built the next level. But generally speaking, I would say, yes, we travel through these. And can one skip one? I think each stratum is important, each step by step. Now on to a fourth proposal. Our culture does not support seasons 4 and 5. And when I say our culture, I include our educational systems, our communities of faith, our businesses, media, other groups do not understand, support, and appreciate people that are going into half-adolescence and second half adulthood. So I would say, if you, whatever label you use for second half, does our culture really appreciate poets, sages, mystics? I don't think most of us, I didn't understand when I was in my 30s teaching, I didn't understand that perspective. I just thought it was very, very strange. So I stuck with my earlier adulthood kind of things. Because of that, I believe, since it does not understand, and by the way, I say Western culture, there are those Eastern cultures and say Native American cultures, American, Native American, that really do appreciate those elders, those wisdom teachers, or some call them even witch doctors, whatever, those that have the accumulated wisdom that went way beyond midlife, continue growing. So there are cultures that do that. Western culture isn't so much. And I think it's shifting, maybe shifting away from it even more. In politics, we used to have what we call these sage politicians. These folks that could reach across the aisle and build coalitions. What do we call them? Pardon? Yeah, statesmen, elder statesmen even, that would do that. And I'm not sure they're electable anymore. I don't know how they would go about that. So it does not encourage, therefore, people are not growing as much as they had potential for. Those that might feel the urges of half-adolescence don't find support and understanding and appreciation, people to mentor them on. And I would say in our culture, not only do we not understand, I think we misunderstand who these sages are, or don't appreciate. I think we actively resist. We don't support, we step and try to stop this thing that's happening. Consider for a bit who most people consider to be immature. This helps me understand a little bit. And I go to Merriam-Webster dictionary quite often to understand what does our culture mean by a term? And a good dictionary is a good way to say, what's the common use of it? Mature, having completed natural growth and development. That's why don't call me mature, because I haven't completed. I'm not near done yet. I don't feel done. I don't believe I'm done. Having undergone maturation. Past tense, having attained a final or desired state, being done. And then in that goes on, of relating to or being an older adult, elderly, of or relating to a condition of full development, characteristic of or suitable to a mature individual. So notice the two different sides to that. And older adult is one who has completed. or from thesaurus, maturity synonyms, adulthood, adultness, related words, middle age, midlife. I'm past middle age, I'm past midlife, therefore culture would say I'm mature. And mature means being done. So to be mature is to be fully developed, to have attained a final or desired state, to have completed the human growth process. Nope, I reject that for myself, but recognize that in surveys, informal surveys, it's almost completely anecdotal. When I ask people about this, I'd say about 75% say, yeah, this makes sense. By about midlife, we're mature. You know, we've completed our growth. Now it's time to act as a mature adult. So I'm part of the minority and happy to be there. And to be mature is to be an older adult, one in middle age, in midlife, who has completed the growth process. That's a cultural definition that I reject. So our culture expects us to have become fully developed persons sometime in middle age. It sees us as fully developed, having completed the human growth process by then. We should be done, according to our culture, many in our culture. So what does that mean to be a mature person? Our culture would say you're mature when you exhibit these seven characteristics. You're certain of things. You know what's right and wrong. You know pretty well who God is. You know what you stand for, and you expect to be steady in it. You know how to fit in with conventional boundaries. You've understood the rules well, and you know how to live within them. You know how to stand up for what's right. You know how to defend against strength with strength. You've attained more. There's a certain level of moreness that you've found. External orientation, you know how to interact with your world. You know how to understand many things. And these are not bad. I take lots of courses in HASP that address these. So understanding what's real and all those things, I understand that, but it's not the ultimate maturity. Group loyalty and ego building, feeling good about yourself. But I'm excited to let you know that you were not mature when you hit midlife. When I look over here, I would be the same as if I looked in a preschool and just say, you know what? We're all in kind of kindergarten. I think of adolescence and moving into second half adulthood, being a kindergartner again. And I've said, hand me the big crayons, because I have to learn to color outside the lines, to think new ways, to be curious about things, and to stumble my way around a little bit, especially in adolescence. So I'm hoping that you are here, that you are willing for me to hand you the big crayons, just to keep learning, keep trying different things. What great news. You're not mature. And you're smiling. That's good. That's good. And a fifth proposal. We're doing okay time-wise. The fifth proposal is that in Western culture, we desperately need models of healthy later seasons of human development. You see, we're a rich culture in folks that are mature, healthy, first half adults. They head up industry. They're in many of our churches. There are examples of healthy, and I know there are unhealthy as well. There are some very unhealthy folks that have self-esteem, but it's an unhealthy, hard form. But there are those that have healthy self-esteem. There are those that are healthily know what they believe. They fit in a convention and so on. So we have many helpful models. But Western culture woefully fails to live up and honor, lift up. When I say lift up, I mean just to raise them up and say, here's an example. Here's someone to emulate and to honor models of healthy, maturing second half adults. And I would say that's true in education systems, in communities of faith, business, politics. One of the challenges I faced when I first retired when I was in my mid-50s and we moved back to Michigan the first time, then we tried California. We keep bouncing back, and every move we make is 2,200 miles. I don't know why, but that's what we did. When we moved back here after retirement, I did a search I was looking for, I called it UHOP, University of Healthy Old People. How do I do this retirement thing? How do I keep growing? So I went to Evergreen Common. I asked them, what courses do you have to help me be a healthy? And they gave me a list of estate planning seminars, which is ironic because Anita was an estate planning attorney. It's just like, okay, I got that. Or you can take a trip to, I forget, starts with a B. There's some trips you can go to this retirement community where you can get early meals and things like that. And it's like, no, I'm looking for somebody help me to keep growing. So I went on the internet. I looked for a UHOP anywhere in the nation. I couldn't find any. Now, maybe there have been some that popped up since then. We just don't have those models, especially in my reformed, quote unquote, tradition of folks that are there. And they have appeared throughout culture, throughout centuries. We just don't lift them up in our education systems and our faith communities. And there's a corollary to it. When a culture's models of full human development are first half adults, we say these are the people we lift up and honor, then I believe that we arrest development. At least we don't support people in that later stages of faith. When second half politicians can't be elected, I'm concerned. When second half pastors are marginalized, I'm concerned. It's like, where are they? Where are they? It's what happened to them? When second half educators cannot fit into their learning centers, it's difficult. It's difficult. I remember when I was at Western Seminary, I'd take the systematic theology courses and so on. Then once in a while, at the end of my second year, professors would say, meet us over at the bowling alley. And we'd sit there and we'd each have a glass of wine or a beer. And then they would let out their mystical side. They talk about mystery. They talk about wonder and says, we need to talk to each other and talk to some folks. I didn't get it, but they knew I wouldn't be angry about it either. So I was receptive to at least being with them. And then when they got back in the seminary again, they needed to be more first half. You understand what I'm saying? It's hard to fit in sometimes when you're different. I consider myself to be a healthy, growing misfit. I'm just a misfit, which makes it challenging, but it also helps to, and developmentalists call that being differentiated, just saying, I know I'm different. I know I'm different, which is one of the reasons I love HAS, because I'm meeting other misfits as well. Those that think a little differently from our culture, those that have a wider experience, those that come to a class like this to explore lifelong growth. So mature, healthy second half adults are needed. It's not that we lack second half models. It's not that they've disappeared. Throughout the centuries, cultures, all kinds of socioeconomic levels, all sorts of things, there have been mentors, models, and guides that have appeared. In Western cultures, we've given them labels, again, such as mystics, sages, poets, saints, prophets, gurus, elders. We've also called them heretical, disloyal, unpatriotic, strange, liberal, and unrealistic. We're not quite sure what to do with them. It's difficult for us to figure all of that out. Some examples, and I have a cover of a book that I go to quite often for my own mentors. For some reason, ever since growing up on a farm, I like to get up around 3 or 4 in the morning, and this is one of the books that I just read, just a page or two at a time. Some we know, some of our mentors we know very well, like St. Francis of Assisi. Certainly Richard Rohr, if you're a fan of his, then you'll be acquainted with St. Francis of Assisi. Jesus, I believe, was an amazing mystic. Speaks more mystery than I ever realized. Thomas Merton, Heifetz, Rumi, Mahatma Gandhi, Ram Dass, Buddha, Thich Nhat Hanh, Lao Tzu, Heschel from the Jewish tradition, Albert Einstein, I included, David Hawkins, Eckhart Tolle, Henry David Thoreau, Plato. So all kinds of mentors there. Others are mostly unknown. Those that have appeared in my life, I just listed down Adriana Steckity. She was part of the Trinity Church when I was there. A wonderful, wonderful mystic. She and her group of, I call them the little old ladies, which they like that name, by the way. Little old ladies that met every Tuesday. Mystical. remember saying to Adriana once, she was sharing something, and I said, oh, Mrs. Steckity, I wish I had known that, 10, 15 years ago. It would have helped me so much. And she literally pulled up her walker, shuffled over to me, patted me on the head, which was wonderful for a senior pastor. That was wonderful. Patted me on the head. Oh, Sonny, you can't learn a 70-year-old lesson when you're 40. You have to be 70 to learn a 70-year-old lesson. I'm thinking, the best developmentalist I've ever met, Mrs. Adriana Steckity, sitting there in that church. Phenomenal. So Adriana, Mary, Sandy, Jim, Juan Carlos Ortiz, I worked with him, Bill, and many others that I have run into. You've certainly come up alongside some yourself, those that you could name for yourself. And that essential mystics, poets, saints, and sages lists quotes from a number of these. We haven't quite known what to do with this cluster of second half adults. We can't quite figure it out. Do we honor or condemn them? Are they teachers or threats? Are they, but one thing we tend to agree on, I've mentioned this before, is that we tend to marginalize them. And there are two good ways to marginalize a person. One is by lifting them up on a pedestal. Say, you're special, you're different, I can't possibly ever be like you. Or the other is to push them to the margins and say, this person is out of bounds somehow, not correct. Remember when I first was an intern, went as an intern to a new church plant in Southern California, and Harold Liestma was the senior pastor. And he sat me down pretty early in my internship and said, Terry, don't put me on a pedestal. Don't do that, because that just is going to cause trouble for you and for me. So he understood that if I put him on a pedestal, I couldn't learn from him very much. Plus, he said that puts me right about knee height, so you can chop me off someday. So he didn't know whether I would or not, and of course not. I still honor Harold in amazing ways. So I encourage us. I keep encouraging myself to hear their stories, to listen to their lessons, to follow in their footprints as well. Then a sixth proposal, more of us are exploring and growing into half-adolescence and beyond than previous generations did. And I believe there are some very strong reasons for that. Even though our culture still doesn't really understand, appreciate, and support later human growth and seasons thereof, and even though we don't have a lot of very strong mentors growing up, yet more of us are exploring it. And there are 6 reasons, I believe, that is true. First of all, we have more time. Later human development is what I call long season crop. It's something that just takes a long time. I know when, I'm a terrible gardener, but when we did, you'd have short, quick crops that would be like green beans, come up pretty quick, and then later on might be some tomatoes. And it seems like every year growing up around here, the season was always too short to have a good watermelon. They'd get close, but then we'd have a frost and we'd lose it. So it's like we have more time. Our grandparents could expect, if they reach 65, which wasn't a given, but our grandparents that reached 65 could reasonably expect 5 more years of life. That's just the way my grandparents were. Our parents could expect 10 to 15 years beyond 65, and our context is very different. A couple of authors put it this way: it's one thing to imagine 5 or 10 years of decline and isolation. It is quite another to imagine 15 or more years of relative health, vitality, and freedom. It just takes time to grow into these things. We have time for long season growth. Secondly, more of us are continuing to grow in midlife and beyond because many of us want a fresh approach to aging. A Merrill Lynch MetLife survey discovered that 3/4 of baby boomers had no intention of seeking a traditional retirement. Instead, boomers intend to create a whole new life stage. We're here. We don't expect decline and withdrawal. We expect to keep learning and engaging. Third, we have a history of transforming life. It irritates many in our culture that boomers keep pressing at limits, keep trying new things. It is our history. And fourth, we are used to even invite complexity. Tracy Carner, an author, put it this way: one may go to school or back to retrain at several points along the continuum. One may marry multiple times and raise multiple families. One may retire and then return to work. The possibilities are multiple. We are used to complexity. And trust me, moving into half-adolescence and second half adulthood will complexify your life. It complexes. You don't settle in. You keep expanding. You think about what a hormone would do to adolescent. Talk about complexifying life. Well, imagine what questions and wondering and curiosity would do in midlife. Many of us expect to continue to grow. We envision our middle and later adult life filled with potential for new beginnings and personal growth that shows up in surveys over and over again. And many of us are open to new values, perspectives, and beliefs. We've been exposed to a multicultural world. I just look in HASP and or in our little community. We live in a new condo development off 40th Street, and met somebody or sat down with somebody yesterday, a relatively new resident, who talked about all her trips to China. And she talked about the culture there. Or we have others that were missionaries in a very different culture. In Southern California, oh my, one of the things I loved about teaching at Crystal Cathedral was there were people that were Hindus, were Buddhists, were Christian Scientists, and so on. I've been exposed to all that. So I'm curious about that. And it's not that gays or somebody. I wrote with Hardasia, a wonderful, loving Muslim. So I've been exposed to it, and it just biggins my world. It makes me curious. I don't fear them because they have names. Now, I might be afraid of a Muslim, but I can't be afraid of Hardasia. I might be curious about who are these Christian Scientists until it becomes Gary. Gary, who sat in a small group, his byline was, "This may be a stupid question, but," then he'd ask the stupid question. And it was amazing what it would, I was teaching in a class once, and we were talking, it was near Easter, so we were talking about crucifixion and resurrection, and a person sat in the back, raised his hand and said, "You actually believe this stuff?" It's like, wow. Put the PowerPoint aside, and the rest of the time the class just talked. So we live in that kind of a world. Narrow, single, and conventional traditions don't hold as strong to us. Now, my dad grew up in Overijssel. His, great-grandfather was part of it, and he lived in Overijssel his whole life. For him, stretching was a different experience than mine, let's say. He was in his 80s when he entered half-adolescence. It's fun to see my dad, an 80-year-old half-adolescent. Wonderful, wonderful. Those of us who choose to include dynamic growth, transformation, and human development are taking a road less traveled. As Robert Frost so wonderfully put it, "I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by," and that has made all the difference. There are a growing number of us that look at that path and go, that's the path. That is a path that I'm drawn toward and I take. And I'm hoping, this is my hope, this may be only the beginning of a rising tide of half-adolescents and second halfers. And one of the basic teachings that many share about cultural shifts, incorporating more half-adolescents and second half, is there comes a time of great turmoil and fighting when those first half adults resist second half. And we get labels such as, pardon? Yeah, losing it, or I've been labeled by family. You're just one of those liberal elites. No, I'm a half-adolescent and a second half adult. I don't accept that. Though I might be a liberal elite too. I don't know if that fits me or not, but I'm hoping that there is a rising tide, even when culture goes through a difficult shift, goes through a difficult time of adjusting. And then seventh and final proposal, and we'll look at this mainly 2 weeks from now. Half-adolescents and second half adults must be proactively lived into. We need to do that actively. As long as our culture does not understand, appreciate, and support us in these seasons, we need to be proactive. We need to form groups like in HASP or small group within it, or in our little complex that's developing, condo complex, a little dinner club, where we talk, and not to make us more radical, not to make us more elite or separated, just to encourage each other, just to help us understand and to catch ourselves if we're getting ornery or something, which we're all prone to do. Okay, a paradox of later lifelong growth. First of all, the top one, and by the way, a paradox usually involves two truths that don't seem to fit, but they keep living with each other. And second half adults love paradox, that this is true and this is true. How can that be? So you wonder and you question it and you struggle with it and you live in between rather than doing either or certainty. This is true or this is true. Second half adult says, yes, both are true. How do we do that? So the first is that lifelong growth in midlife and beyond is a gift. It's something that it's a mystery. How do I get prompted with these questions? Where do they come from? I didn't wake up one morning and say, well, it's time for me to be a half a lesson. There's something inside of me that stirred me. And for me, that meant if you look at the 7, when I shifted beyond those first 7, I knew I no longer fit in the Crystal Cathedral, because I was expected to teach certain ways, to live a certain way, and I had more questions than my role allowed. And fortunately, I married an attorney so I could retire in my 50s and pursue it and wonder about it and earn a doctorate and study all these things. So I was very blessed. I am concerned for pastors that I've talked with that really can't afford to do that and they struggle. How do I grow? What do I do? And I talked to an old mentor here who met me soon after I retired and says, you're retired. So what do you believe now that you're no longer paid to believe? Wow. Strange question. What do I believe that I'm not? Well, I'm sure I believe the same thing I was paid to believe. He just smiled. So we met for 2 years, worked on it. So it's a gift, something that happens to us, something that we're prompted, something that we're wooed into. But the other part, at the same time, it's something we actively enter into. Needs to be intentional with some disciplines that really help us move into it, some ways of separating ourselves from some. And I'm working toward a course in the spring. How do we react to churches when we're in second half adulthood? Do we leave churches? Do we stay? How do we step back? I believe that many people are leaving churches because they have more questions. They like the questions. The answers don't quite fit anymore. So we'll look at that more. What do we do with that? So we welcome, we receive, we enter into these very actively. Again, we don't continue to grow because it's the path usually taken. That one that goes off to the left in this graphic, it's one that goes off the beaten path. It's not always easy. It's not always the way most go, but in my mind, path of continued growth is the way to live a life fully lived. I believe a faith fully formed comes from continuing to grow and the life journey fully taken. I guess I'm kind of greedy that way. I want to experience all that life has to give me, and that means to continue to grow. So we'll take the road less traveled. And then Misgivings, another poem by Robert Frost. You may discover that I love Robert Frost. Any of you know Misgivings? Oh, if you forget everything else, take this one. Take this one. Misgivings, you'll find it on the internet. All crying, we will go with you, O wind. Talking about, in this context, getting older. I will go with you, O wind. The foliage follow him, leaf and stem, but a sleep oppresses them as they go. And they end by bidding them as they go, and they end by bidding him stay with them. Since ever they flung abroad in spring, the leaves have promised themselves this flight. Oh, now would fain seek sheltering wall or thicket or hollow place for the night. And now the answer is summoning blast with an ever vaguer and vaguer stir, or at utmost a little reluctant whirl that drops them no further than where they were. I only hope that when I am free, as they are free to go in quest of the knowledge beyond the bounds of life, it may not seem better to me to rest. I go back to that poem from time to time. If I get weary or just kind of lose interest in things, I go back to this poem and say, there is something that seems to draw people back. Wilbur says up to 80% of the people they say, oh, when I'm retired, then I'm going to, and then they kind of settle in where they are. I hope that is not true for me. Second question, how many people choose a further journey into half-adolescence and second half adulthood? Ken Wilber suggests that only 20% of us are growing into half-adolescence and beyond. And by the way, I looked for statistics on it. I tried really hard to find them, even met with George Barna staff once and said, could we include a couple of questions in your annual thing to just see how many people are moving into it? And he says, you have no idea how difficult it is to get a question, how expensive it is. So basically he said no. So I keep watching. And next week is a course on people leaving churches. So I'm hoping he found some statistics. So I'm going to pay attention for him too. My observation is that 20% is probably pretty close, but I would expect from what I've heard in HASP that the percentage is quite a bit higher. We seem to have broader experience and to be pressing on. So I would expect sitting here or watching in Zoom, the percentage to be much higher than 20%, but that would be generally an exception. And I know that adolescence phases in around the time we enter our teens. That's where hormones jump in and brain changes and so on occur. But what about for half-adolescence? It's not as easy to predict, but I think in terms of a bell curve. Again, I've talked with people who have experienced half-adolescence in their 30s. That would be more toward the beginning of the bell curve. And like my dad, as I mentioned before, experienced it in his 80s, where his language started changing and he wondered about things and we could sit down and talk about different things and so on, more toward the other side. But I would guess that midlife seems to be that 50s to 70s tends to be kind of the peak of the bell curve. And some things happen around that. It reaches toward maybe frustrations with more career, higher positions, more income. That's a crisis, or losses. Losses trigger some half-adolescence type questions. The easy answers that we had as younger adults don't quite fit anymore. So that would be a bell curve, somewhere 50 to 70. For me, it was more in my 50s for whatever reason, that mystery. Richard Rohr, Zen masters, those from other cultures that really understand later development, did not allow a young man to come and study spirituality until he was at least 35. Carl Jung imposed similar restrictions at his institute in Zurich. The Roman Catholic Church has had comparable guidelines in canon law. For example, one could not become a bishop before the age of 35. So they would say that first part of the bell curve, it takes time. That's why when I see Jesus moving through half-adolescence into later adult development, already as young as he was, thinking, my goodness, that is incredible, incredible. And I see that in other cultures as well. So their long experience taught them that. Then is life in second half adulthood better than life in first half adulthood? I hear that a lot. First of all, no. It doesn't make any sense to say that it would be better for a toddler to be a adolescent. That's a funny question. That toddler is wrong place. No, a toddler needs to be a toddler. So first half adults need to be first half adult. Would it be better for a first half adult to live with second half values, perspectives, and beliefs? No, because first half adults are where they need to be. So no, it's not better. Yes, it is better. Teenagers have encompassed and expanded beyond the potentials and perspectives of toddlers. Their world is bigger, they can contribute more. So yeah, it's a better place to be in one respect. Half-adolescents and second half adults have expanded their worlds. They're able to work with more people to understand. Their empathy is greater. They're able to deal with the complexities of the world. So yes, sometimes it is. And then sometimes, when adults are ready for and have received an invitation, when they find support to overcome barriers, yeah, in that situation, it is a good thing. So 7 proposals form the basis of this course. And I propose them to you. You can smile, you can scowl, you can have lines on your forehead that go this way or this way. That's fine. Those in Zoom can react different ways. You certainly have permission to do so. So now I'm eager to hear from you. Questions, comments? Do I need therapy? Well, maybe I do. We'd have to ask Anita about that and Jean, but I have been a therapist, a first half therapist sometimes. I wait for, she'll bring you a mic, so that's Zoom people.
It seems to me that, like the perception of people who are not involved in this. For example, instead of seeing an incline, you have going up and then a plateau, or let's go up. This younger group, there's a big bulge before you get to either the plateau or this up. Where they attribute more knowledge and more they false wisdom, I might say, that they might feel, but because of their age and present age, with their more familiarity with technology and that they feel people who are past that are less. And you feel, sometimes I feel dissed or like I said, losing it, or you're put into a category where you're not. I don't know if that's a common feeling or just mine.
It's easy to feel that, isn't it? Feel marginalized. It's like Jean's having trouble with her printer. She needs to find a junior hire to fix it. Can't figure it out. Or for me, in terms of, I did some online teaching and learning Zoom and learning to put classes together. And it's easy to feel marginalized in some respect. And that depends, in my mind too, what we value. Do we value wisdom? Do we value what we have to offer and let the first half adults conquer first half things? But yeah, I understand.
As I'm sitting here and listening and looking at what you're talking about, I'm thinking of the book I'm reading now. It just came out by Arthur Brooks, called From Strength to Strength. It is exactly what you're talking about regarding the bell curves, about when different people in different professions reach their bell curve, and it has a lot to do with professions. I've not gotten through half of it yet. So he is talking about what happens in the first half of life. He has not talked about what we do in the second half of life. I would highly recommend the book, From Strength to Strength by Arthur Brooks.
Okay. Can't wait to add that to my Kindle. Yes, there.
First of all, great job.
Thank you.
This is very interesting. My question is, with the addition of technology in our generation, we saw it emerge. Has that changed the different levels of growth, or somehow influenced the inquisitiveness of knowledge and perspectives and other views? You talk about learning when you're in California, you're exposed to much more. So how has technology changed?
Yeah. In terms of technology or exposure to a broader range, I think it gives us more freedom. Or I think about my dad living in Overijssel all those years, very conservative, part of the neighborhood that was his friendship group and so on. It's difficult to step outside of boundaries. It was difficult for him to be exposed to different things. So I think technology, being able to read different things, hearing different perspectives and so on, does help us to move beyond of saying, it's like realizing that's provincial. That's a very narrow perspective. And the more I see elsewhere, the more I can say, oh. But knowing too that just because we get exposed through different technology to different cultures, it's also possible to be very first half and say, oh, I'm right, they're wrong. That's that either or certainty. Or to say, oh, that's not my convention. Because when I go to church or to my faith, it says, we believe, we confess, we believe this, they believe something else, they must be enemy. So I know that's not always true, but I think it opens doors, that technology. When I became very curious about, I'll say it, and I believe this is true, that I probably learned more about what it means to be a Christ follower in the way of Jesus by these last years, seeing what it means to be a Christ follower in the way of Muslim or Buddhist. So I look at how are they following the universal Christ in their tradition? Then I look at what they say and how they react. Then I go back to Jesus and say, I wonder if that's what Jesus was saying. I wonder what that parable means from that perspective. And I keep growing as a Christ follower in the way of Jesus because I could go online and I could read these things and I could be curious about them. So I think I believe technology is a great help. Great help. More exposure.
I think technology is a real pain. I mean, to me, it's the thing that keeps me from expanding. Do you remember the commercial? I don't even know what they were selling, where these elderly people, their grandchildren visited and they handed them all these and said, this doesn't work. None of this works. And it was phones. And I went to a technology seminar in Las Vegas 20 years ago. And they said, my generation thinks we're going to break something, where the younger generations thinks this software is lame.
Mhm.
And that's what keeps me. I just run up against technology and my inability to troubleshoot so much.
Mhm.
I just wanted to add that.
Let's just say we renewed our Geek Squad subscription for that. It's a challenging. It's a different way of thinking. It's different. And when I did some writing, some online writing and so on, I had to hire somebody to help me with that because I didn't. It's a challenge. It's a pain, but pain's not bad. Pain's not, in retrospect, yes.
I just wanted to say that another couple of resources, Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upwards,
The best, one of the best.
is really, really good. And the Dominican Center in Grand Rapids has wonderful opportunities.
Oh, they do. I haven't.
Oh my gosh. It's amazing what they've got.
Okay. Awesome. Good
So-
resources. Good resources. Yeah, Falling Upward. And I get Richard Rohr also has a daily email. I read that every morning because he stretches a different tradition a little bit. It's Roman Catholic, but wonderful because he talks a lot about second half issues as well. Second half. Pardon? Oh, yeah. Yep. He has weekly themes. I read it this morning.
Thank you for a pat on the back from the beautiful lady over there. I am a self-professed Luddite. And the other book that I am reading and have not completed is called The Chaos Machine, and it's about technology.
Chaos Machine. I
Yes.
like it. So we have two olescences. One is half olescence. The other is techno-olescence or something. It's like anything in the chat that you've seen. Okay.
So I'm inferring from a number of your comments, perhaps incorrectly, that a lot of this has to do with starting off in what I would call a more parochial, traditionally conservative kind of worldview, and moving into one, as you said, maybe liberal elite, to put a label on it and short circuit it. If one is kind of in that position in their first half adulthood, then what does that say about their opportunities for further growth into second half adulthood?
Yeah. First of all, when I talk about convention, we think of conventional a certain way in Southwest Michigan. There's also the convention of street gangs. There's a convention of very liberal type settings, say in one of our favorite cities is San Francisco, because you move 2 blocks and there's a new convention. You go to Chinatown, there's a convention there. You go to, the gay community, there's a convention there. So that, but if you're really tight into a convention, it really is an adolescence. It really is a struggle. And I had a relatively strong convention because I was a pastor in the Reformed Church in America. And you pass your classless exams and you teach and then go to the Crystal Cathedral, where I promised to be loyal to the teachings and the tradition of the Reformed Church and to stand by the values and the teaching of Robert Schuller. So that was pretty tight convention. And that, I believe that most of us grow up in a convention. We need conventions. It's how would you start off as a 20-year-old into young adulthood and then, watch Fox News and watch CNN and read this and read that and listen to this and listen to that. It'd be so confusing. You settle into a convention. And then to move in, is that a challenge? Yeah, it is. It is a challenge to move beyond. Had a friend in early church. His name was Gambino. He came out of the Detroit Gambino heritage, and his father left that, a very strong convention. And he was enabled to do that and become an evangelist. But for Frank, it was for his family, it was a struggle. Strong convention, it's stepping out, stepping beyond is a challenge. It's a challenge for all of us, and the tighter for my dad to step out of just tight teaching of over ISO Reformed and I call it the informal theologies, the informal values and so on. It took him till his 80s. It was difficult. Anita's folks, her father, actually transferred from one church to another when he was in his 80s, as well. So conventions are very helpful. And one of the pictures I have is half adolescence as you start bumping into the boundaries of convention. And if it's a very strong convention, a very tight convention, moving beyond that boundary is turmoil. Did that help, or just follow up?
Yes. I'm feeling that I didn't ask the question very clearly.
I didn't hear it.
And it's a little bit hard for me to verbalize it here, but I guess if one in earlier life has adopted kind of the values and the mindset that we're all equal and diversity is a positive, and the way I do it isn't necessarily the answer, and a number of those kinds of things. If you're in that position in your first half adulthood, then where can you go beyond that to continue to grow and develop in your second half adulthood?
Sure. And that there are those folks that I've met that have their convention is very open. You could say their convention, what they were taught, their group, their family helps them be wide open to people and say, we don't have all the answers. For me, there might be other shifts that happened. There was one lady I met in a coffee shop in San Clemente, California, and she asked what I was doing when I was working on the doctorate. And I told her different things, say, oh, I believe all that. I believe all that. So she had that part of it. That would be an easy shift for her. But she also talked about, getting her degree and building a career and building a family. So maybe in that one area of shifting, she had a lot of foretaste. maybe that shift for her would be very easy. The either or certainty would be she's already pre-learned that, or she's had that possibility of happening very easily, but she still needed her time in accumulating. And she still needed her time in working with externals. And she talked too about, and I'm not sure quite who I am. I'm not sure how I fit anymore. So she still needed some ego building. So it could be in this one arena that she was doing great, but she still had that strata to build. So I love folks that grow up where they don't have that tight provincial, or maybe where they grow up in multi-cultures, where it's not us versus them. I think they have a head start. I have a head start.
I have a question from the chat. Do you think people can move back and forth between seasons?
Yeah, Ken Wilber talks about growing up, which means you're growing up through the seasons. And he talks about waking up. You know, the more we grow, the more we can see. But he also talks about cleaning up. And that is where there's residual stuff. Like to say, I'm all done ego building. Well, if you all sat there scowling at me, I'd need to go home and build my ego back up. So I know it's really, I don't know if I have one close or not, but no. If you look at that slope, it's not that we leave the earlier ones, it's that we keep adding to it. So yes, there is cleaning up that I have to do. Can you move back and forth? There are some days I can shift into first half adulthood so fast if somebody cuts me off in the car. Oh, I'm just a first half. I'm angry, or I read some of this political stuff. And I go into warrior mode and I want to go out and shout something, or I want to, do something to push back against it, or they are totally wrong. All this political party is all wrong. I'm all right, either or certainty. So it's more like we still have that cleanup to do. We get pulled back into it. I don't think that shifts me back across half-adolescence back into adulthood. That says to me, there's still a shadow. There's still cleanup to do. One of the advantages I had growing up was going to school in a little 2-room red brick schoolhouse where we had 5 grades, kindergarten through 4th grade. Well, we had some models of 4th graders who were awesome. And then you get to be a 2nd or 3rd grader and you could still clean up, because you'd be sitting there and the people would be at the little table. And any of you had that experience, multi-grade? Yeah, you could review it. You could keep learning it over and over again. So I think there are lessons that I need to relearn. There are first half parts of me that still reside. And I recognize that something I learned in therapy is that when I get really angry with somebody because of how first half they are, when I get inordinately, it's called projection. There's something in me that I still need to deal with. So I don't think of it as shifting between. I think I have expanded into half adolescence and then second half adulthood, but I know I still have a lot of first adulthood in me. Hope that helps. Thank you. I appreciate your time, and I hope to see you next week. We'll talk about the 7 expansions, and I'll have all kinds of quotes and other people that build into it and see if you resonate with them. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it.